Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update.
The need for a GMAT score that for you is much higher than any other demographic group, right? Being Indian in general, you'll need it much higher.
Then tell us a little bit about your GMAT prep also. How did you go about preparing yourself while working?
Books. And the GMAT, I mean, to be honest, I think it's quite an interesting exam to take. I don't know if it's the best measure of your capabilities, but it's an interesting exam to take, right? And it's something that you can continue to keep challenging yourself with. And that's how it happened, right? I actually ended up getting a decent score in GMAT as well because of that.
What were some of your strong sections? What were the sections that you had to work on? How did you go about working on them while working full-time? A little bit more on that.
The need for a GMAT score that for you is much higher than any other demographic group, right? Being Indian in general, you'll need it much higher. That having been said, the Indians as well as the Chinese, for that matter, we're naturally good at math. Most of us are naturally good at math just because of the way our educational system is set up. Yeah.
Right.
So to give you an example, the GMAT basically has 3 sections, right? So one section doesn't matter as much, though you need to do decently in it. It's about kind of writing and communication and things such as those. But the 2 primary sections, at least the time that I did, I don't think it's changed, is English and verbal. Sorry, English and math, verbal and quantitative, right? Each of these, the maximum score is 51. So if you get a 51 in each section, you get an 800 score, as an example. Yeah. When I did my first practice test, my math score was already 43. Again, like I said, because of that kind of Indian educational setup, my English was at about a 35, right? Which at that point gave me around a 650 or 660, which is nearly not good enough to get into a good school as an Indian male.
Right.
Yeah. So I worked, actually, funnily enough, even though I think my English is quite decent, I worked a lot on my English because it's not just about conversational English here. You know, it's about things such as grammar and rules that you really have to get into the theory of to be able to crack it. Yeah. My advice to anybody who's thinking of giving the GMAT at any point of time is to understand that there's a peak, right? Is that you practice and you reach that peak. And then if you continue to practice, you at some point, it's a bell-shaped curve and you will go down, right? So the timing of when you give your GMAT is supremely important. I ended up actually getting a 770 on my GMAT, which is a decent score. So a 50 in math and a 45 in English. And that would get you into any good education.
What is the structure of this program where you spent a year in HEC and then you did a 6-month-long internship and then a year at Cornell? And what is that program called? How did you find out about it? And quickly, what were the 3 things that you picked up that were different from your previous MBA experience?
I mean, so to be honest, when I eventually applied, I got into a couple of schools. I actually chose HEC, right? So it was supposed to be an HEC MBA. While you're at the HEC MBA, based on things such as your grades as well as your extracurriculars, etc., there's certain merit-based immersions that you can do at partner schools around the world. Right. So that's how Cornell happened. So it was actually 1 year at HEC, a 6-month internship, and 9 months in the US. It wasn't a year in the US, right? But this was an opportunity about 20 of us from the batch got, if we wanted, to immerse ourselves into a different business school experience based on grades. Yeah. So that was how I did that. And to be honest, most business schools around the world will have something of the form, right? They call it different things. They call it immersions. They call it double degrees. They call it multiple things, but most business schools will have it. The 3 things that I took out the most, I think the biggest thing was the kind of potpourri of cultures, right? I think all of us in some shape or form will say that we've interacted with people across the world and all of that.
Right.
But I promise you, being in a group, and this is my example, being in a group, right? A 6-person group where I was the Indian, my partner was Mauritian. I met her in my first ever working group. There was a Russian, there was a Mexican, there was a Chinese. Each of us, I came from marketing, somebody came from sales, somebody came from finance, somebody came from HR. And all of us just had such different styles of working and work ethic. It presents a scenario that no matter what you've done in your life or how old you are, you're absolutely unprepared for. So that's something that over time, I believe I've kind of, I think just trying to put myself into people's shoes because of these experiences has made me a much more empathetic professional, for lack of a better way to put it. Right? I mean, it's something as simple as the Japanese talk much slower when they're working and need some time to absorb everything, which is a fast talking Indian I don't understand or didn't understand for the beginning. Right? But that took some time. But eventually when you get there, they can provide more than I can ever. Right? And that's something that took a little bit of learning. So yeah, that potpourri of cultures and working with different kind of cultures is something that I absolutely cherish. And this was more HEC than Cornell, because the American business schools end up having they have people from all over the world, but it ends up being 60% American. Right. While European business schools end up being very, very, very diverse. Yeah. Another thing that I picked up, and this was more from Cornell actually, was kind of how different entrepreneurship is different in different parts of the world, right? So at Cornell, and Cornell is actually a business school that's known for entrepreneurship in some ways as well, you had about 35 to 40% of the class that came into the MBA already with a business idea that was, developed in different ways.
Very different from the usual MBA program in India. For example,
absolutely.
In India, most of them are not even looking at entrepreneurship, even though they are doing a business degree.
So, absolutely. And that's just what, right? So you had 35 to 40% of the class, even though they came to classes and participated in work, their primary focus was about how they could take the learnings in each of those modules and apply it to their business, right? And I know at least of 3 or 4 success stories now out of the people that I met at Cornell that did that, right? But just coming into an MBA with that mindset is something, like you mentioned, right? That an Indian MBA we never think of, because we come into it completely like, let's figure it out. And that's something that I found really, really interesting as well. And just the perspectives that these people brought to class discussions was absolutely novel and something that, we wouldn't ever think of. So for example, when we had an entrepreneurship module, as opposed to coming up with fake business ideas, each of us actually joined these teams and helped them develop their own business idea. And it was absolutely amazing. That would be the second. The third I would say is actually, and this is something that I think Indian business schools can really, if possible, focus on a little more, is practical learning and real life kind of practical learning, right? So at HEC, there are 2 events, I would call them for lack of a better way to put it, that are absolutely standout, right? One is called the MBAT, which is an MBA tournament, right? That hosts 3,500 people at HEC over 5 days. It's a sports tournament that is completely run by the MBA batch of that year, where we have about 25 to 30 business schools from all over the world, including the US, coming down to Europe for 4 days, right? And it's a company in itself, because you're dealing with catering for 4,000 people, you're dealing with logistics from one part of the campus to the other, and there are people who do the MBAT at HEC actually don't have to do 3 electives because they focus completely on running this large-scale event, right? The budgets are enormous, the logistics are huge. But I mean, the kind of experience you come out of, especially as an organizer of one of those events, is something that, cannot be replicated, right? The other example of real life learning that I wanted to talk about is we do something called, it's at HEC, is called Sancerre. It's basically a place in France where we go for 5 days and do military training. So we actually stay with the military, the French military, and do kinds of team building exercises and aspects such as those. You come out as a richer person in some ways. That's something that I think I really cherished in my MBA experience in Europe, that I think Indian experiences could do a little bit more of, for sure.
Okay. This takes me to the next thing. You've also worked for a Tata company just like your dad, which is the JLR. JLR is supposed to be this, mecca of great engineering, great automobiles. What was that experience like, those 6 months?
It was a really interesting experience going. So it was basically my MBA internship. So it's like how out of MICA we have our 3-month MBA internship. It was actually also meant to be a 4-month internship, but it got extended a little bit because of some work that we were doing that they wanted us to continue. Yeah. It was really interesting because my internship was actually in Shanghai. So we were based out of France remotely when we needed to work on some stuff, but otherwise it was based out of Shanghai. And we were, and speaking of, the engineering piece that you talked about, we were actually working on consumer uptake of the autonomous driving capabilities.
Wow.
So
Okay.
what we were really studying is, in China, which is a market like India with congested roads and things such as those, and erratic driving habits. If autonomous driving capabilities, and this was obviously 2015, so it's been about 5 years now, but if autonomous capabilities came into play, in a partial way or in a full way, how would consumers, adapt to that? Would it be in phases? Would you need to do it by parts of the city? How exactly would that happen?
Right.
So it's absolutely interesting because just to give you, a small thing that came out was the driving behavior of the Chinese is so erratic, a little bit like us Indians, is that it was postulated that once autonomous capabilities becomes all over, that's fine. But in that time where you had some autonomous cars on the road and some non-autonomous cars,
Right.
there actually be more accidents because of that kind of driving behavior. So things like this came out that was super interesting.
Johann, you're in the final year now of your MBA. You're almost on the verge of finishing, and you're figuring out placements, etc. What was your approach to placements, and were you happy with where you ended up eventually from campus?
That's actually a good one. So Kunj, so when after Condé Nast, right, as well as JLR, and I think you know this a little bit about me, knowing me personally, is that there was this little bit of an intrigue in fashion and luxury and things
Right.
such as those, right?
So that was
So when
actually my next question, that what is this obsession with luxury and fashion?
I
Tell me. Yeah.
Yeah, but I can answer that also with this question. Actually, it's really funny is that when I was doing something, when I was doing my economics at Stephens, right? Something as simple as a luxury good defies the fundamental law of economics and having an upward sloping demand curve is something that just intrigued me at that point. Right? It was a small seed that was sown that nothing really happened of. During my time at MICA, that's when, I started reading up a little bit, met some people, met Manmeet Vora, who's a MICA alumnus, etc. Indeed. And started to get a little bit more intrigued about kind of luxury fashion and things such as those. And in fact, my thesis at MICA was kind of luxury in the Indian consumer context, understanding that, right? So gave myself a little bit of a theoretical understanding, etc. in it as well. And then I worked at Condé Nast, did my internship at JLR. And the way that I looked at it, I was at HEC, I was in Paris, right, which is the mecca of luxury all over the world. So my aspiration really then was, and it was really hard because my French is conversational, but I don't speak great French, even though my wife is a fluent French speaker, I should be speaking much better. Right. What I actually really wanted to do was see if there was a way that I could kind of, take this intrigue in fashion luxury in that kind of European Parisian context, which is super pure, right? So I kind of applied. The truth is I applied to a lot of the big companies in the French context, right? So the LVMH, the Burberrys, the kind of Kering groups of the world. Right. But that's when the lack of French for me did play a part. Right, because of the fact that a lot of these big companies would require you to at least be socially fluent in the language to really make an impact, right? And once again, going back to what we talked about earlier, then in terms of recalibration, I said, if I still really want to work in fashion and luxury and in Paris, how can I recalibrate my expectations to still make this happen? And that's when I started looking at companies that were slightly smaller, right? Not the big brand names, but companies where I could still get that experience. And that's when I came up with this startup, or came across this startup rather. It was called My Fashion Agent. What it basically did is provided consulting for niche brands and designers that were looking to make a dent in the European market, right? So you had a swimwear fashion brand based out of Corsica in France. You had a Japanese brand, based out of Tokyo that wanted to enter into Europe, etc. Right? Small brands, niche designers, things such as those. But working with these kinds of brands in a 10-person company, I was able to make an impact as well, right? Because it was just a bunch of us kind of doing everything from making the morning coffee to sitting in the room with the CEO the same day. And I absolutely loved that experience. That having been said, and I know this is going to be our next question, so I can preempt it, but that having been said, I think during that year or year and a half is when kind of the fashion bubble or luxury bubble burst in some ways as well. And when I say burst, it's not that I'm still not intrigued absolutely by the industry and the domain, but luxury, especially in places like France, can also be a very political kind of place, right? Where suddenly it's not the kind of hierarchy in the Indian context, but a different kind of hierarchy and politics that plays a part. And at some point I realized that while I loved the work that I was doing, my growth opportunities would be limited in some ways. And that's when I started looking for new opportunities. Working and living abroad on a full-time basis is just a completely different ballgame, right? And I mean, to be honest, I absolutely love it. I mean, you might know this, but Amsterdam, everybody bikes to work, bikes everywhere, right? So you're biking to work. I bike to work every day. I bike back from work every day. You're partying on Friday night. You're going on a bike. You're biking back slightly drunk at 1 a.m. on Saturday morning. And it's a completely different experience, obviously.